My question is for James. I am a highways designer, graduate, but it's getting there. And my question was, in terms of your collaboration with Highways England, is there any sort of like design guidance on how to implement like positive change for or social change on projects?
Swap. So I think there's guidance on a few levels and there's a lack of guidance on a few more. So the specifics, and in terms of perhaps the specifics of the built environment, there's guidance all over. It's not always particularly up to date. But for things like the pedestrian environment, you've got manual for streets, you've got inclusive mobility, which I understand is they're looking to update. I think there's the specific guidance around things like access to buildings and, sort of, for example, railway station infrastructure, all these kinds of things. Equally, in terms of delivery of wider project processes, there is guidance coming out of the ears of some people in the sector in terms of what the process is in terms of delivering and developing a highways project. So you'll never be short of guidance for that side of things. What I think there perhaps is lacking is a clear and fully articulated link between what some of the things that we do, so a quality impact assessment, non-motorised user auditing, other perhaps road safety auditing, what that actually means for how you take the design of a project forwards. I think other processes are a bit more developed, so NMU auditing and road safety, probably there are stronger connections between the design process, but the quality impact assessment, we effectively have to feel our way a little bit. And we've seen delivering projects for Highways England, but also in other transport sectors, so for Network Rail, that we've had to work out ways as we've delivered these pieces of work to evidence and ensure that what we tell project teams about the accessibility or inclusion components of a scheme are actually fed in, and how they evidence that they've been taken on board or rejected, because not everything that an equality impact assessment will throw up will necessarily be feasible to incorporate. So, and we recognise that, you know, we don't proselytise about this. So I think that there is guidance, there's very specific guidance, and it's very detailed, and there's also guidance about how to deliver, but there's a bit of a gap in the middle, I think, between how you apply, how that guidance ultimately gets fed into a project, other than having a designer simply read it.
Just to add to what James has said, I referred to some work we're doing on shared space at the moment, and without going too much into detail, but just to sort of agree with James that there is a gap. So actually we're quite good at a profession of measuring things to do with a transport basis. So how many miles journey time we've saved, cost benefit analysis, we're quite good at that, because that's what transport and government has asked us to do. When you come to assess whether a scheme has created an inclusive environment, actually that's quite difficult, because the measures there aren't there. So one of the outcomes from our work in shared space will be saying to government, actually we need to do some proper research into what those measures might be, because if you're not able to measure it easily, and it's not a requirement to, then it doesn't get done, and therefore surprisingly you end up with something that isn't inclusive. So your point is a good one, and I agree with James that there definitely is a gap, and certainly I think we've recognised that, and we'll be pushing to work with government to fill that gap.
It's easy to think about inclusion and diversity measures being things like access to buildings and the way in which you do that sort of thing, but can you give me some idea of some practical measures or practical things that have actually happened on the ground as a result of all of this sort of thrust towards inclusion and diversity that maybe I wouldn't have thought about?
Because it's my favourite area to talk about, I'll talk about an accessibility and disability example from a project delivered up in Hull. what we had was proposals for a major redevelopment of an urban road scheme in Hull, and we had a series of project processes, and it was going reasonably well, and the project was developed, and we had a bit of a communication breakdown with a local user group. So the issue was that a local access group, so a local group of people with mobility impairments and sensory impairments who comment on transport and infrastructure schemes, had pointed out some potential drawbacks to the scheme for their members and the kind of users, and the scheme hadn't been able to respond in a way that they were satisfied with, and the relationship had somewhat broken down. So we worked closely with Highways England, and this was a Highways England-led initiative actually, to consciously bring on board those user groups as part of the delivery of the scheme. So there was a full engagement exercise where the designers and the project team met with members of the access group, and they took them out on site and they walked the route, and the route that they walked proved problematic for some of the users, and the challenges that those users faced as they kind of worked with the project team really hit home to some of the guys on the project, that if part of your journey is not accessible, your whole journey is not accessible. And some groups who went out and walked had to turn back after 20 minutes because they couldn't get they physically couldn't get any further along. And so what the upshot of it was that you had a project team who was much more acutely aware of the needs of a particular set of users and a particular section of the community. You had a user group who felt that their concerns had been listened to, that they had been engaged in the development of the project, and the subsequent stages and subsequent components of the design benefited from a much more proactive approach to bringing on board the perspectives of that user group and others, to ensure that what resulted was more inclusive and more accessible, and the kind of the communication breakdown that happened for the kind of the larger project wasn't replicated across the planning permissions that were secured for smaller components of the project as it progressed. So using some of the tools we did in the quality impact assessment, we did some kind of broader stakeholder engagement with them, and it was quite a success story in terms of bringing a potentially excluded group on board and helping them to effectively, ultimately champion the scheme to an extent that they probably wouldn't have done otherwise.
I can remember as a divisional engineer 30 years ago, we were working near a blind school. So I sent all my designers to the blind school for a day, and they were sent out with eye shades on to pretend to be blind to understand. So I think that sort of thing has been around, but maybe not as universally, I suppose. I was thinking about, is there things that we wouldn't have thought about that have struck you in doing this work? All of a sudden a light comes on and says, crikey, I didn't realise that was a problem. That's something we need to look at now.
Anecdotally, and that's all it is I sat as part of a workshop on hidden disability. So whilst you might imagine what it's like to be visually impaired or physically impaired, you never quite get it because it's not. But actually sitting in a room with people with hidden disabilities just changed my view completely. So listening to somebody, it wasn't about a highways example, who wouldn't go to Birmingham New Street Station because they suffered from a particular form of mental disability, because the shiny outside surface of Birmingham New Street is incredibly challenging to people with certain conditions, which I just would never have even thought about. So that person and people like them would not go to Birmingham New Street because it made them scared out of their life. And I thought, wow, that is, you just wouldn't think it. And so you have to understand that there's a huge range of people who have got different needs, and we have to build that into what we do. And it makes it's at a time inconvenient, it's difficult because you've got to understand something that we don't understand, and it may take more time. But actually, the thing I always came back to was somebody said, actually, if you create an inclusive environment, it's going to be better for everybody, and that's got to be the measure at the end of the day. If it works for everybody, it's better. So we need to do it.
I think that's true. Recently I took a look at the accessibility of a project just down on the Thames, which had a component which was really, really interesting. It involved a lowered walkway that, when the wake of certain large ships went past, it overtopped. So you had a little bit of interaction with the water from the river on the foreshore. The idea was to connect people to the river, which is a really fascinating and interesting idea. They were a bit worried, though, that that doing that might be a bit risky for people with pushchairs and people with wheelchairs. So they made that level of the concourse inaccessible to people who were in wheelchairs or had pushchairs by making it stepped only. So people physically couldn't get down there. That was the solution that was proposed to the safety of the space. Now, practically speaking, that might be a perfectly sensible thing to prevent certain kinds of users from risk, the risk there. But it prompts a whole range of questions about why you're creating a space, who you're creating it for, and what you intend to do to make sure that everybody can use it. And sort of passive-aggressive provision to ensure the safety of certain users is incompatible with a lot of the goals of accessible spaces. So, if you don't want people who aren't very mobile to use a level crossing, the solution is not to put a stile in front of it so that they can't get to the level crossing in the first place. The solution is to improve the nature of the crossing more fundamentally. Some of these things are these are the things that I've kind of learned from being involved in the design process over the last sort of 7, 8, 9 years, is that some of the things that might seem sensible and practical and pragmatic are often hugely exclusionary and can have a huge impact on the extent to which certain kinds of users feel that they are able to participate in community life, able to participate in the infrastructure that's provided for the general public, and that can have one of the biggest impacts actually on inclusion, is just by making people feel that they're not welcome.
Becky from Living Streets, the formerly Pedestrian Association. So I respond to a lot of consultations, and I end up advising quite a lot on accessibility. It's not technically our niche area, but in that we are trying to promote places for everybody and all people, and that's something that comes into it. So I think I just wanted to add to that as well. I think that there is an issue which I've definitely come across working with shared space. It's almost impossible to design for every need, almost impossible. And I'd love to see what came out of that report actually, just because even if you're looking just at physical impairment, even there, what you want to put in for a visually impaired person with a guide dog, for instance, won't work for a wheelchair user. So it's a really, really tricky area. The more you dig into it, the more you go, oh my goodness, how do we meet these? So just wanted to add that to that. My question was actually for Matt. I was just interested, you talked about the legacy of the project, and we do a lot of walk to work projects. We work with a lot of businesses trying to get them the behaviour change elements. Obviously that project was great because it had the capital spend against it, and that's an important component of any legacy. I was wondering how you worked with individuals to kind of make sure the behaviour change was sustainable. Because we get the issue, obviously, the end of our project time comes, and then it's very easy for we walk away, and then if we're not careful, within a few weeks, people have stopped walking to work. And
yeah, I mean, ITP primarily were engaged with the businesses rather than the individual employees, and we worked with Sustrans. They were appointed to do the one-to-one engagement with employees, and I know sort of their key thing is to try and get, like you say, long-term sustainable change, and that might be not getting someone to make a whole-scale change, so that it might be too big a commitment to change every day of the week, but instead say, well, actually, one day a week can you do that? Severn Trent, who are one of the businesses that we work with, they were relocating to Pride Park, where there's massive parking issues, which was a key reason why they wanted to get involved with us at business level. And they introduced a Green Day initiative. So it meant that people who drive to work 1 day a week, they had to either find somewhere else to park or come by other means. So there was a bit of a stick there, and I think that's the thing is we can provide incentives, but I think having a stick really helps too. So that initiative was something that they started through us, and it was awarded the initiative of the year when we did our awards, because we thought it was quite a novel idea, but that will have continued like beyond. So I think it's primarily getting the organisations on board so that they aren't just doing it because we're there to do it for them. So getting them to continue the initiatives once we're gone, and obviously once the DFT funding run out, the amount of support, I mean, ITP stopped delivering the project, but they had offices in-house that were continuing to deliver it, but it was a much more hands-off approach, so it was down to the businesses themselves. We gave them online resources and that sort of thing, but it was more about sort of getting the employers on board and getting them to do the promotional work for us. But things like the connected website, obviously that's a legacy measure that continued. So yeah, I don't think there is an easy thing, but I do think with everything you need a carrot and a stick. And I know a lot of employers are reluctant to use the stick approach because they want to be seen to be a nice employer. But at the end of the day, limiting parking or putting a parking charge in is a big incentive to not drive. And a city like Nottingham, where we're based, obviously they've got the parking levy, and that's had a massive impact because a lot of businesses have passed the cost of the parking levy on to their employees. So rather than them bearing the brunt, they've passed that cost on. So £350 a year is the parking levy. That's a massive incentive to use park and ride or public transport or walking and cycling. So I do think the stick, particularly if it's hitting your pocket, is probably going to have a bigger difference on employees, because I don't think employees, things like the environmental agenda don't have a big impact on individuals. Health does, so letting people know the health benefits, but I don't think environment has an impact on individuals.